The announcement came on a Tuesday, delivered by a royal herald in gold-trimmed livery who rode a horse far too fine for the muddy courtyard of Greymoor Hall. The scroll he presented bore the seal of House Helver, a silver hawk clutching a thorn bush, and the words within were polite in the way that only truly threatening documents dare to be. Lord Grevan Greymoor, firstborn son of the Marquis of Greymoor, was to be formally betrothed to Lady Alara Helver, second daughter of Count Aldrich Helver of the Eastern Marches. The wedding was to take place before the first snow of winter. All relevant parties were expected to comply. Grevan read the scroll twice, standing alone in the small study that had been assigned to him, not the grand library which belonged to his father, nor the weapons room which his younger brothers shared like a den.
His study was the kind of room a household assigns to someone it does not quite know what to do with. Narrow windows, a single bookshelf, and a desk with one leg slightly shorter than the others. He had shimmed it himself with a folded page of parchment. The court called him the useless son, though never to his face. He was the eldest of the Marquis Roderick Greymoor's children, and therefore theoretically the heir to everything: the lands, the title, the political obligations that came with owning a stretch of fertile valley between two rival counties. But Grevan had never been observed doing anything particularly heir-like. He did not hunt, he did not drink in the great hall with his brothers, he did not court the daughters of allied houses. He read mostly. He walked in the early morning when the grounds were empty.
He spent long hours with the steward going over crop rotation schedules and drainage maps in a way that made everyone deeply uncomfortable because nobody could tell if he was being diligent or simply had no other friends. The whispers that circulated were vague in the way that the most damaging rumors always are. He was strange, he was weak, he was, perhaps, simply not suited for the life that had been handed to him. His father, the Marquis, was a pragmatic man who had long since accepted that his firstborn was a puzzle he lacked the patience to solve, which was, as it happened, precisely what made him useful. When House Helver came with an offer too politically complex to refuse and a daughter too difficult to place anywhere else, Roderick Greymoor saw the elegant solution immediately. Grevan could have the difficult daughter. If anything went wrong, it would reflect on him, and Grevan had no reputation left to lose.
What the Marquis did not know, what very nearly nobody knew, was what Grevan had been doing in that small study for the past 11 years. He set the scroll down on the desk, carefully, and looked at his hands for a long moment. Then he went to the bookshelf, removed the third volume from the left on the second shelf, and placed his palm flat against the wall behind it. The stone shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to reveal a narrow space within, barely large enough for a grown man to stand inside. He stepped in, pulled the volume back into place from within, and was still. For precisely 4 seconds, nothing happened. Then a soft luminescence bloomed around his fingers, not orange like fire, not white like conjured light, but something between silver and deep blue, the color of water in moonlight. It traced the lines of his palm, climbed his wrist, and settled into his skin like ink absorbing into parchment. He exhaled once, slowly, and the light faded.
9th Circle, the highest tier of arcane mastery in the known catalogs of the mage academies. There were perhaps 3 practitioners alive in the entire kingdom who could walk that road, and they were all ancient, celebrated, permanently attached to royal courts or legendary institutions. None of them were 26 years old. None of them were standing in a hidden alcove in a minor noble study, reading betrothal notices. Grevan Greymoor stepped back into his study, replaced the book, and allowed himself exactly one moment of something that might have been amusement. Then he began to wonder with genuine curiosity what Lady Alara Helver was actually like, because the rumors about her were considerably more colorful than the ones about him, and he had learned long ago that colorful rumors about women were almost always someone else's story being told in someone else's voice.
Grevan arrived at Helver's seat, a sprawling estate called Thornwall, named for the enormous hawthorn hedgerows that encircled its grounds, with a revenue deliberately smaller than protocol suggested. 3 outriders, his personal steward, and a single trunk.
He wanted to be underestimated. He was very good at being underestimated. The Count met him in the receiving hall with the kind of formal warmth that functions as a warning. Aldrich Helver was a thick man with a permanent expression of mild disappointment, the sort of nobleman who had built his entire identity around a grievance so old he had forgotten its original shape. He clasped Grevan's hand and smiled with all his teeth and not a single part of his eyes. "Lord Grevan," he said, "we are delighted to welcome you. My daughter will join us at dinner. I trust the ride was comfortable?" "Entirely," Grevan said pleasantly.
He noticed three things in rapid succession: the slight tightening of the Count's jaw when he said, "my daughter," the way the two men flanking the Count wore the hawk and thorn sigil of House Helver but moved like men accustomed to giving orders rather than receiving them, and a single window on the second floor where a curtain had moved fractionally as though someone had stepped back quickly from the glass. He said nothing about any of this. He commented instead on the architecture. Ilara Helver arrived at dinner precisely on time and sat at the far end of the table in a dress the color of storm clouds, her dark hair pulled back with the kind of brutal efficiency that suggests someone who has been told too many times that she is beautiful and has decided to make it inconvenient for people to notice. She did not look at Grevan immediately.
She looked at her wine glass, which was empty, and at the footman who had not yet filled it, and then she looked at the footman until he moved faster. The court called her difficult, cruel, some said, ungovernable, said others. She had turned down 2 previous betrothals, once by publicly dismantling the logic of her suitor's financial arguments in front of his entire delegation, and once by simply not appearing until the party left. She had argued with a bishop. She had, on one memorable occasion, written a formal letter of complaint to the Royal Exchequer, so precisely worded that it had resulted in an actual audit of 3 minor lords. Nobody could explain why a count's daughter had the knowledge, connections, or sheer audacity to do any of these things. She raised her wineglass and looked at Grevan for the first time across the long table.
Her eyes were the color of deep water, and they measured him in the way that only people who have been measured too many times know how to measure others, quickly, completely, and without much hope. Grevan inclined his head. She held his gaze for exactly 2 more seconds than was comfortable, and then looked away. After dinner, while the Count occupied himself with port and political performance, Grevan walked the East Garden corridor, a habit he had announced in passing, casually, in the way one mentions things intended to be overheard. He was not surprised when he heard footsteps behind him. He was mildly surprised that she'd come herself rather than sending a servant with a message. She stopped 6 feet away, which was the distance of someone who trusts their own judgment, but not yet yours. "You're not what they said you were," she said. It was not a question. "Neither are you," he said. A long pause.
"There's a plan to present them to the Royal Council within the month. They'll claim your father made promises he didn't make." "How long have you known?" "Since the 3rd meeting," she said, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who has been angry for a very long time and has had to become calm about it. "I overheard my father and brother 3 months ago. They don't notice me when I'm quiet. People rarely do." Grevan looked at her for a moment. She stood very straight, the way people do when they've learned that dignity is armor. "They'll notice," he said quietly, "when this is finished." The forged documents arrived at the Royal Council 18 days later, not through a slow political channel as anticipated, but through an emergency petition that Count Helver had apparently been building toward all along. The charge was breathtaking in its ambition. That Marquis Roderick Greymoor had 11 years prior pledged a section of the Greymoor Valley, specifically the Millwater Tract, which held the only reliable ford across the Tarn River for 30 miles, as collateral in a private agreement with House Helver, and had since defaulted on that agreement. The documents were objectively quite good forgeries. The seals were aged carefully, the language period appropriate, and the signatures were close enough that even a trained herald would have needed time to be certain. Count Helver stood before the council with the quiet confidence of a man who has spent years constructing a lie so thoroughly that he has begun to believe it himself. His delegation was large, his arguments polished. He had political allies in 3 of the 7 seats. He was certain, accounted for everything.
He had not accounted for Grevan Greymoor walking in with a single leather satchel and requesting the floor. The room received him the way rooms always received him, with the mild, vaguely puzzled tolerance reserved for people nobody expects much from. He was young. He was the useless son. He had brought no intimidating retinue, no thundering advocates, no dramatic presentation. He opened the satchel and removed a stack of documents of his own. "If it pleases the council," he said, in a voice that carried the room without strain, "I would like to address each of these claims in order. I will be brief." He was brief. He was devastatingly, surgically, irrefutably brief. The supposed agreement of 11 years prior was dated to a month in which Marquis Greymoor had been, with documented witnesses, in the capital, attending a session of the very council now hearing the petition. The travel records existed, the inn receipt existed.
The letter of introduction he had presented to the council master-at-arms on that date existed, still filed in the archive, and Grevan had brought a certified copy. The seals on the forged documents used a wax mixture that had not been commercially available until 7 years ago. Grevan had a letter from the Candlemakers Guild explaining as much. The signature, while close, differed from Marquis Greymoor's actual signature in 4 specific ways that became apparent when laid against 20 years of authenticated correspondence, which Grevan also had copies of. He laid each document down as he spoke, one after another, the way a careful craftsman sets down finished work. The council was very quiet. Count Helver's face had done something complicated and was now doing nothing at all, which was worse.
Furthermore, Grevan continued, I would like to draw the council's attention to the land registry for the Eastern Marches, specifically the notations on the Millwater tract from 3 years ago. He found the relevant page without looking, as though he had memorized the document's geography. House Helver filed an improvement claim on adjacent lands that would only be financially sensible if they anticipated ownership of the Millwater Ford. This filing predates this petition by 3 years, suggesting that the petition was not responsive to a genuine grievance, but rather an attempt to legitimize a planned acquisition. One of the council members, an older woman in the seat of the Eastern Judiciary, leaned forward and looked at Grevan the way one looks at something one has badly misjudged. Lord Grevan, she said carefully, how long have you been aware of this matter? Since shortly after my betrothal was announced, he said. My lady Ilara brought it to my attention.
The room stirred. Heads turned toward where Ilara Helver sat in the gallery. She had insisted on attending, and nobody had quite known how to refuse her. She met the room's gaze with the composure of someone who had expected exactly this moment and had spent a long time deciding how to wear it. But then the chamber doors opened. Count Helver's elder son, Martin Helver, came in with 6 armed men, and the situation became something else entirely. Martin was not interested in legal proceedings. He was, as it turned out, the sort of man who had a contingency for when legal proceedings failed, and the contingency involved trying to physically seize his sister and retreat before the council's guard could respond. It was a desperate plan, and he had committed to it entirely. He made it 4 steps into the chamber.
Grevan was already moving before the doors had finished opening, with the kind of fluid, unhurried speed that comes not from urgency, but from having decided something before anyone else in the room knew a decision was necessary. He placed himself between Ilara and Martin Helver with the precise stillness of a man who does not need to shift his weight to be immovable. Martin's hired blades drew steel. Grevan drew nothing. Lord Grevan, Martin said, with the contempt he had never quite bothered to hide. Stand aside. You're no fighter. Everyone knows that. Grevan looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone reading a not very interesting document. You have, he said conversationally, made several assumptions today that are going to be expensive. He raised his left hand. The first blade came at him fast and high, a professional strike aimed for the shoulder.
Grevan stepped inside it, not back, inside, the counterintuitive movement of a swordmaster who has spent years studying how much space violence actually needs, and redirected the man's elbow with 2 fingers, precisely, into the path of his own momentum. The mercenary folded without quite understanding what had happened to him. The second and third came together, which was sensible tactics. Grevan sidestepped left, let the right-hand man overextend, and brought his forearm across the left-hand man's sword wrist at the joint. The sword clattered. In the same motion, still without drawing his own blade, he caught the overextended man by the collar and introduced his forehead to the edge of the council dais. He'd drawn his sword by the fourth, not because he needed it for what came next, but because there are things a sword communicates that empty hands do not. The remaining 3 hesitated.
Trained men hesitate when something doesn't match their internal model of how violence is supposed to proceed. Martin Helver watched his hired contingency dissolve in approximately 12 seconds and arrived at the realization that he had, perhaps, miscalculated. He tried to grab Alara anyway, because men like Martin often commit to a plan so hard they cannot release it even when it's clearly failing. He got past the hesitating mercenaries, shoved a council aide aside, and reached for her arm. His hand closed on empty air. Grevan was there. Not quickly. There was no visible movement, no dramatic interposition. He was simply between Martin and Alara, the way a wall is between one room and another. "I'm going to ask you to stop," Grevan said quietly, "because what happens if you don't isn't something I want to happen here." Martin was not ultimately a brave man.
He was a man who had spent years operating in conditions where he controlled all the variables, and Grevan Greymoor had spent the past hour meticulously removing all of them. He looked at Graven's face and saw something there that made him very still. He lowered his hand. The council guard arrived 40 seconds after it was over, which is roughly how long it takes to unlock an armory and run up 2 flights of stairs. Count Helver was detained. Martin Helver was detained. The 6 hired men were detained, 3 of them requiring a healer first. The council deliberated for 6 hours and then delivered a ruling that stripped House Helver of several land claims, imposed a substantial fine, and forwarded evidence of the forged documents to the Crown's Office of Justice for formal proceedings.
Grevan spent those 6 hours in an antechamber with a cup of tea he didn't drink and the company of the Eastern Judiciary Counselor, who turned out to be named Wren Ashford, and who had, apparently, been following the theoretical literature on Ninth Circle arcane theory for the past decade and had several pointed questions she had been waiting a very long time to ask someone who actually knew the answers. They had a genuinely good conversation. Alara found him there when the deliberations ended. She stood in the doorway for a moment, reading the room. The empty teacup, the silver-haired counselor who was in the middle of making an emphatic point about spell lattice mechanics, Grevan's expression of polite engagement, and then came in and sat down. Counselor Ashford looked at her with the assessing gaze of someone who has just understood the shape of a larger story. She made her excuses gracefully and left them. The antechamber was quiet.
Outside the narrow window, the city was doing what cities do in the late afternoon, settling, adjusting, beginning to tell itself what had happened today in the form of rumors and half-correct accounts. By tomorrow, there would be a dozen versions. The useless sun would become something else in most of them, though the specific something else would depend on who was doing the telling. Alara looked at her hands, which were entirely steady. "You knew," she said, "about my brother's contingency, the men." "I suspected there would be one," Grevan said. "Men who build as much as your brother has built generally don't let it end in a room without trying something physical. You could have warned me." "Yes." A long pause. She looked at him directly. "Why didn't you?" He thought about it honestly, which was something she was already beginning to understand he always did. "Because I wanted you to be able to walk into that gallery without carrying it," he said finally. "You'd been carrying things long enough." She was quiet for a while. Outside, a bell was ringing the evening hour from a temple 3 streets away, low, bronze, patient. "What happens now?" she said. "The legal process takes its course," he said. "Your father and brother will answer for it. The lands that were theirs legitimately will remain so. You should have that. There's a house on the northeastern border of the Helver estate, near the old mill, that passed into your name when you came of age.
It's yours entirely, not entailed. Your father couldn't touch it if he wanted to. She stared at him. How do you know about that? Land records, he said mildly, are very interesting. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was closer to one than anything she had made in a long time. Then she looked at the window, and the evening light coming through it, and was quiet in the way of someone letting attention she's forgotten she's been holding finally release.
"What do you want from this?" she said at last, not accusatory, genuinely asking. He considered. "I want," he said carefully, "to see what you actually are when no one's trying to use you. I think that might take some time." A pause, if that's acceptable. The bell finished tolling. The echo of it lasted a moment longer than the sound itself. Ilara Helver looked at Grevan Greymoor, at the man who had read the land records, preserved the evidence, walked into the hardest room in the kingdom with a leather satchel and made it quiet, moved through violence like water finds its level, and then sat down afterward to argue spell theory with a 60-year-old magistrate over cold tea, and made a decision. That, she said, is acceptable. It was not a grand conclusion, it was the beginning of one, and sometimes the most consequential things begin not with ceremony, but with a careful, honest yes from someone who has finally met a question worth answering.